The opening scene. Fire as the family's final signature. The flames did not simply burn. They moved like living things, swaying and lunging as if responding to some silent music in the night air. They devoured the edges of the old photograph, slowly, almost tenderly curling it inward, until the faces of the Merrick family warped and dissolved into blackened ash. The crackle of burning paper was soft but steady, a metronome marking the inevitability of the scene. This is how it always ends for the Merricks. Not in bed surrounded by children and grandchildren, not in the gentle fading of old age, but in fire, always in fire. It has been so for more than 2 centuries across continents, wars and eras. The location changes, the architecture changes, but the result is the same flames consuming lives that seem prepared for their arrival. I am Marcus Wells, and you are watching the ghastly journal where we exhume the darkest tales the past has left us. Tonight, I offer you the cursed history of the Merrick family, a history bound not just by blood and name, but by a pattern of destruction so exact it defies probability. And before we proceed, I will warn you, as I have never warned an audience before, the things I'm about to tell you will not leave your mind easily. If you are listening in the dark, perhaps now would be a wise moment to flood the room with light. But not a candle. Never a candle. The pattern that shouldn't exist. The Merrick story is not merely a chronicle of tragic accidents. It is a tapestry of deaths arranged with such meticulous symmetry that to dismiss it as coincidence is to ignore the deafening rhythm beneath it. Each chapter ends in flames, yes, but the way those flames behave, their timing, their color, their deliberate sparing of certain lives, betrays something far older and more calculating than chance. My own investigation began in curiosity, driven by the morbid magnetism of a mystery unsolved for over 200 years. I expected folklore and rumor-vague recollections in dusty letters. Instead, I found precision. The dates align with surgical accuracy, 20 years from one death to the next, always on the winter solstice, always with the surviving children far from home. The flames do not just kill, they arrive as though invited their path through rooms and across landscapes, unnaturally direct, as though they know exactly whom they have come for. If you think of death as a lottery, then the Merricks are a family who hold the winning ticket every time, only here the jackpot is annihilation. And the odds against such repetition astronomical. This is why I say to you now, if there is such a thing as a curse that can be traced and measured, this is it. Our journey will begin not in the smoky ruins of a modern tragedy, but at the beginning of the line in a place that no longer exists, on any map erased, as though the earth itself conspired to hide it. Blackmere, Massachusetts, the town that vanished. In 1796, Blackmere was a small coastal settlement clinging to the edge of Massachusetts like a barnacle to rock. Sheltered by high granite cliffs on 3 sides and the churning Atlantic on the 4th, it was a place built for secrecy, invisible to passing ships unless they knew exactly where to look. It no longer exists, not in postal records, not in modern atlases, not even in the muttered recollections of old fishermen in seaside bars. Its absence from history is almost complete, as if the land itself swallowed its own name. Yet it was here that the first Merrick, a man named Jonathan, planted the seeds of both fortune and doom. He would go on to create one of the most powerful shipping dynasties along the eastern seaboard, a name synonymous with influence, trade, and an uncanny resistance to the unpredictable wrath of the sea. Blackmere was the ideal birthplace for such a venture, a harbour hidden from storms and prying eyes alike, where fortunes could be built without the interference of jealous competitors. But the town also bore scars, whispered stories of strange lights in the forest, unexplained warmth in the dead of winter, and a history of fires that spread faster than wind should allow. From this place of beauty and unease, Jonathan Merrick's empire would rise. And from this same place, though no one could see it, then the family's doom would crawl steadily toward them, waiting with patient, ember-bright eyes. The rise of Jonathan Merrick. Jonathan Merrick's ascent from destitution to maritime magnate remains one of the great unrecorded miracles and mysteries of early American commerce. Born in 1765 to poor farmers in rural Massachusetts, his early years were an exercise in scarcity, a diet of bread and root vegetables, clothes patched and repatched until the fabric gave way. The daily grind of survival without hope of upward mobility. Tuberculosis claimed both his parents when he was just 14, leaving him entirely alone in a world that was not kind to orphans. By the logic of the era, his fate should have been sealed: servitude under a wealthier family, harsh labor in someone else's fields, and a short life marked by exhaustion. Yet by the age of 25, Jonathan owned his first merchant vessel outright. By 30, he commanded a fleet that outperformed and out-earned competitors up and down the eastern seaboard. His ships seemed to sail in an invisible corridor of favor. While others contended with storms, piracy, and misfortune, Merrick's cargo always arrived intact. His profits always exceeded expectations. Contemporaries spoke in awed tones of his sea luck, while rivals muttered darker suspicions that he had bribed the weather itself or found a patron not of this world. Jonathan himself offered little explanation. In polite company, he attributed his success to discipline, keen observation, and an instinct for risk that paid off more often than not. But there were details that didn't fit: missing financial records from his earliest ventures, eyewitness accounts of unusual cargo never declared to customs, and above all, a single year in his youth completely unaccounted for after his parents' deaths. The missing year and the black stone ring. In the official record, Jonathan Merrick simply vanishes for 12 full months, sometime between the ages of 14 and 15. There are no apprenticeship contracts, no labor logs, no church attendance noted in parish ledgers. It's as if the boy stepped off the map and returned wearing another man's skin. When he reappeared in Blackmere, it was not just his demeanor that had changed, though that in itself was startling, marked by a newfound poise and confidence, but also his circumstances. He carried coin enough to secure lodging, dressed in clothes finer than any his neighbors had seen him wear, and most intriguingly wore, on his right hand, a ring of dark, lustrous metal crowned with a black stone that seemed to drink the light. Reverend Thomas Holloway, who recorded his impressions in a March 1795 diary entry, remarked that Merrick's eyes held a knowledge that belies his years, and that when he spoke of the future, he did so with such certainty, one could mistake his words for prophecy. When Holloway, out of pastoral curiosity, inquired about the ring, Merrick smiled a slow, knowing curve of the lips and called it a reminder of a promise made. He refused to elaborate. It was not the only curious account from that period. A local fisherman named Ezekiel Porter claimed in his own journal that he saw young Merrick standing at the edge of Blackwood Forest one autumn evening, speaking to something in the shadows. The air around him shimmered with heat despite the bitter cold, and when he turned to look, his eyes reflected the dying sun like polished copper. Porter fled without a word, convinced he had seen something no man was meant to witness. Blackwood Forest, the land of fire. Spirits, Blackwood Forest, loomed large in the lore of the Blackmere region, its reputation one of quiet dread. The Wampanoag people, the land's first inhabitants, refused to enter it, naming it the place where the fire that lives between worlds resides. They spoke of an ancient ritual meant to channel this fire for warmth and protection during harsh winters, a rite that demanded strict boundaries and offerings of grain or crafted goods, never blood or flesh. According to their oral tradition, European settlers disrupted the ritual, dismissing its taboos as superstition and violating the forest with hunts and logging. In the wake of this disrespect, the fire spirit's hunger turned malignant. When you feed it wrongly, one elder told me during my research, it comes to take what it needs. Historical records reinforce these tales in unsettling ways. From 1650 to 1800, the region experienced an abnormally high rate of fire-related deaths, homes reduced to ash in minutes blazes that burned blue in the heart of winter. A British anthropologist writing in 1762 described stumbling upon a stone altar deep within Blackwood's interior, set in a perfect circle where nothing grew. The altar itself was partially vitrified, its surface melted into a glassy sheen that would have required temperatures far beyond those of any natural fire. No one knew or admitted what had burned there. It was into this forest, according to Ezekiel Porter's account, that Jonathan Merrick had wandered during his missing year, returning with the ring, and perhaps with an arrangement sealed in heat and shadow, the legend and hunger of the fire spirit. The Wampanoag stories I gathered about Blackwood Forest were not casual fireside tales meant to pass the time. They were warnings shaped by centuries of experience honed into precise instruction for survival. The elders spoke of an entity they called the fire that lives between worlds, a presence neither fully of our realm nor entirely outside it. When treated with reverence, it could be a guardian of warmth in the bitterest winters, a giver of safety to those who approached correctly. But when the ritual was disrupted, and in their telling the blame lay squarely on the settlers, who ignored all taboos, the entity's nature shifted. It was no longer content to receive harmless offerings of woven cloth or grain left at the forest's edge. It hungered for life, and not just any life. It sought the brightest flame, the human spark, the transformative moment when flesh and bone surrendered to heat and became ash. To the Wampanoag, this hunger was not metaphorical. They spoke of it as plainly as one might describe a neighbor's appetite for fish or venison. Settlers dismissed these stories, but the historical record shows a disturbing correlation. Every decade after the forest's desecration, there were clusters of unnatural fires. They moved as though guided by intention, often sparing neighboring structures while reducing their target to nothing but a glowing outline in the dirt. It was into this web of superstition and documented calamity that Jonathan Merrick re-emerged from his missing year. To those who paid attention, it was as though he had walked into the forest as a poor orphan and returned as the favored child of something far older and far more dangerous than any man. The marriage to Eleanora Whitfield. If Jonathan's reappearance marked the birth of his fortune, his marriage to Eleanora Whitfield cemented his social legitimacy. The Whitfields were a respected family, their name carried on the lips of physicians and scholars throughout the Massachusetts coast. Eleanora's father, Dr. Thomas Whitfield, was the region's most sought-after physician, a man known for both his skill with the scalpel and his ruthless standards in choosing his associates. When word spread that Jonathan Merrick, a man with no family name of note and a background obscured by rumor, had successfully courted his daughter, the town's elite murmured in disbelief. Privately, Dr. Whitfield opposed the match. Surviving correspondence from Eleanora's cousin Abigail hints at the depth of his unease. Uncle Thomas says there is something not right about the Merrick fellow. He claims to have seen that look before in patients who have made bargains with their own sanity. Yet Eleanora would not be swayed. She spoke of Jonathan's promise, a life free from the hardships that had taken her mother, who perished in a house fire when Eleanora was only 6. Some in Blackmere whispered that this shared trauma was the hidden glue between them. Each had known the terror of flames consuming all they loved, and perhaps each sought to master that terror by allying with someone who seemed immune to misfortune. Eleanora's beauty was often described in muted terms: porcelain skin, dark hair, an air of grace. But what struck acquaintances most was her reserve. Even as the mistress of one of the grandest homes on the coast, she rarely appeared at social gatherings, preferring the quiet company of her children and the view from the harbor windows. The first Merrick children and their unsettling traits. The Merrick offspring, William born in 1798, Elizabeth in 1800, and Thomas in 1802, were raised in a cocoon of privilege. Tutors from Europe instructed them in languages, mathematics, and the classics. Ships brought fine clothes and toys from across the Atlantic. They wanted for nothing, at least in the material sense. Yet visitors to the Merrick household often left with a subtle sense of unease, as if the air inside was charged with something unseen. William the eldest carried himself with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. His headmaster at Phillips Exeter described him as preternaturally serious, rarely smiling, speaking only when necessary, and always with a gravitas that unsettled his classmates. Elizabeth, by contrast, was drawn irresistibly to flame. From a young age she lingered near the hearth, her gaze fixed on the dancing tongues of fire, as if reading in them a secret language. Servants caught her more than once feeding scraps of paper to the flames, watching the curling smoke with a faint, satisfied smile. Thomas, the youngest, suffered from night terrors so vivid that he kept detailed notes, later preserved in his medical diaries, of dreams in which he saw a world consumed entirely by fire. In these visions, he claimed there was no panic, no chaos, only a sense of cleansing inevitability. To outsiders, these peculiarities might have been dismissed as quirks of personality. But in hindsight, and with the full weight of the Merrick history pressing down, they seem like early symptoms of something inherited, an invisible mark passed from Jonathan's mysterious year in the forest into the blood of his children. And if the family had any inkling of what lay ahead, they gave no sign, at least not in public. The night of December 20th, 1816, the first great fire. The winter solstice of 1816 fell on a night of brittle cold and wind that bit at exposed skin. In the harbor below the Merrick mansion, the sea hissed against the granite cliffs, restless but subdued under a sky heavy with stars. Inside the grand house, fires burned in every hearth, warding off the frost that crept through the glass panes. But shortly after midnight, witnesses in the town saw something they could not explain. The flames erupting from the Merrick home were not the red-orange of common fire. They were blue and white, their movements unnervingly purposeful. One fisherman claimed the blaze seemed to climb the walls like a living thing, as though it were seeking. The housemaid Sarah Pendleton later told the magistrate that in the weeks before, Jonathan had been locking himself in his study for hours, marking off days on a calendar with a force that tore the parchment. She heard him speak of the approaching due date and terms being satisfied. On that final night, some swore they saw him at an upstairs window, unmoving his face, calm, even resigned, as the fire licked around him. He made no effort to flee. By dawn, the mansion was reduced to smoldering ash. The official cause, a candle tipped over, or perhaps a log rolled from the fireplace, was the sort of tidy explanation towns prefer. But those who had seen the unnatural hue of the flames, or heard strange chanting that night, knew otherwise. And curiously, the three Merrick children, William, Elizabeth, and Thomas, were nowhere near home, each sent away under separate pretexts in the days prior. They survived. Their parents did not. William Merrick, the heir's uneasy inheritance. In the aftermath of the 1816 fire, William Merrick, barely 18, inherited not only his father's shipping empire, but also the quiet suspicion that clung to the family name. Outwardly, he embodied the model of a responsible heir, shrewd in business, careful in his dealings, expanding the company's reach, while avoiding the kind of whispering rumors that had followed Jonathan. In 1825, he married Catherine Montgomery, a match celebrated in Boston society for its blending of wealth and refinement. They had two children, Jonathan II, named for his grandfather, and Victoria. Yet, in private correspondence, letters later found in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, William's composure cracked. In one to his brother Thomas in 1830, he wrote, "I find myself calculating the years remaining to us. Father died in 1816. 20 years from then will be 1836. I look at my children, at my dear Catherine, and I wonder, do they sense it too? The inexorable approach of the flames." He debated telling his wife the truth, but feared she would think him mad. His letter ends with a line that chills even now. "Perhaps I am." William's outward success masked an inner life of dread. Each passing year was another notch on the clock, counting down to an anniversary he could not bring himself to ignore. When 1836 came, he did not face it alone. The fire had more than one target: Elizabeth Merrick. The philanthropist's ordeal. Elizabeth II Merrick child never married. Instead, she devoted her life to charitable causes, her most ambitious endeavor being the establishment of an orphanage in New York City. She poured her inheritance into it, ensuring the children under her care had warm beds, proper clothing, and daily meals, luxuries she knew all too well were rare for orphans. Yet her fascination with fire never left her. Staff reported that she personally tended the building's hearths, lingering by them for hours. In the final months of 1836, she conducted repeated fire drills with the orphans, and staff instructing them with unusual precision on escape routes and gathering points. On the night of December 21st, 1836, the same night her brother William met his fate, fire tore through the orphanage. Every child and staff member escaped unharmed, guided exactly as Elizabeth had trained them. Only she remained inside, last seen standing in the main hall as the flames closed in. One child later told a reporter that Elizabeth had been holding a strange black ring, speaking softly to the fire itself. When the roof collapsed, there was no scream, no frantic rush for the door, only a calm acceptance, as though she were fulfilling a role rehearsed long ago. In the official report, her death was listed as a tragic act of self-sacrifice to ensure the children's safety. But the details, the timing, the eerie composure, the ring fit the same pattern that would continue to unfold in the Merrick family for generations. Thomas Merrick, the physician who hunted the truth. Thomas, the youngest of Jonathan and Eleanora's children, took a different path from his siblings. Where William embraced commerce and Elizabeth devoted herself to charity, Thomas immersed himself in medicine, a discipline he hoped would offer both answers and control. After graduating from Harvard Medical School, he established a respected practice in Baltimore. In 1830, he married Sophia Reynolds, a woman of intellect and calm temperament, and together they had 3 children, Leonora, Robert, and James. Yet even in the relative peace of his family life, Thomas was unable to escape the pull of his father's legacy. His medical journals, preserved today in the archives of Johns Hopkins University, reveal a man driven to the point of obsession by the mystery surrounding his parents' death. He began collecting every artifact, letter, and rumor tied to the family's past. He studied cases of spontaneous human combustion, fire-related fatalities, and ancient myths of flame-bound spirits. At one point, against his own scientific instincts, he consulted an occult practitioner. She examined the black ring temporarily entrusted to him by William and turned pale. "It contains something that does not belong in our world," she told him. "It feeds on the moment of fiery transformation. What is bound by blood can only be unbound by blood." The warning haunted him. In June of 1835, he wrote, "I fear I am running out of time. There must be a way to sever this cord before it tightens around another generation." His urgency was well-founded. Like clockwork, the winter solstice of the 20th year was approaching, the triple death of 1836. The night of December 21st, 1836, should have been an ordinary winter solstice. Instead, it became the night that etched the Merrick curse into undeniable pattern. In 3 separate cities, Boston, New York, and Baltimore, 3 separate households went up in flames within hours of each other. In Boston, William Merrick's stately home was reduced to glowing rubble, his body found in what had been his study. In New York, the orphanage Elizabeth had run with meticulous devotion collapsed in an inferno that spared everyone except its founder. In Baltimore, Thomas and Sophia's home erupted in fire so quickly that neighbors swore it was alight from all sides at once. The most telling detail: not a single Merrick child perished. In each case, the children had been sent away in the days before William's to visit in-laws Elizabeth's in the care of fellow trustees, and Thomas's with Sophia's sister. Among Thomas's papers, investigators found a letter dated December 20th, written to Sophia. "I have failed to find a solution. The price must be paid. Send the children away tomorrow. They must live to continue the search." Officially, the 3 fires were tragedies unrelated in cause or origin. But those who had tracked the family's strange history saw it differently. The dates, the deaths, the spared children, they formed a precise cycle, an inheritance as deadly as it was deliberate. Cementing the 20-year cycle. After 1836, even the most skeptical chroniclers began to acknowledge that something uncanny was at work. The deaths of Jonathan and Eleanora in 1816 had been tragic but dismissible as coincidence. The simultaneous deaths of their 3 children exactly 20 years later under near identical circumstances were harder to ignore. Among the few surviving Merrick family letters from the 1840s, a recurring theme emerges, a quiet, grim awareness of the next dates circled in the unseen ledger of their bloodline. Survivors calculated their years with a fatalist's precision. Some lived in denial, clinging to the hope that the pattern would break. Others made preparations, will draft instructions for the care of their children, even letters to be opened decades later, explaining the truth. The curse, or compact as some called it, was no longer an unspoken suspicion. It was acknowledged in private parlors and sealed correspondences as a fact of Merrick life. The understanding was simple. Each generation would enjoy 20 years of prosperity, protection, and uncanny luck, and then on a winter solstice the fire would come. The children would be spared to ensure the cycle continued. In this grim economy, the Merricks became both beneficiaries and debtors, bound to pay a price they no longer remembered agreeing to. And if any wondered what would happen if there were no children left to inherit the bargain, those questions were spoken softly, if at all. The 1856 generation. Deaths in 5 cities. By the mid-19th century, the Merrick family had scattered far from its Blackmare origins. Jonathan II managed the family's maritime interests in Boston. Victoria married into wealth in Philadelphia, and their cousins, Eleanora, Robert, and James, pursued comfortable lives in other corners of the country. For 2 decades after the 1836 infernos, they thrived. Investments doubled, businesses expanded, and illnesses that felled neighbors seemed to pass them by. But those who knew the family well spoke of a shadow in their eyes, especially as 1856 drew near. Letters from this period are tinged with apprehension, even resignation. On December 21st, that shadow became fire. 5 separate blazes ignited in 5 different cities: Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Chicago, and Richmond, claiming the lives of all 5 Merrick cousins. The children of each household were absent, sent to relatives under various excuses. Eyewitness accounts from each scene shared uncanny similarities, flames that burned white at their core, moving with a speed that mocked firefighting efforts, and a strange stillness in the air, as though the world were holding its breath. In Philadelphia, Victoria's lady's maid later described watching her mistress sit before a mirror, brushing her hair with deliberate, measured strokes, whispering to her own reflection, "I am ready. I have kept my part of the bargain." Minutes later, the bedroom windows glowed with blue light, and the flames surged outward. No survivor could dismiss the synchronicity as mere chance. The 20-year cycle had proven itself beyond doubt. A family that learned to wait for fire. In the years following 1856, the Merricks stopped pretending the curse was a mystery. Among themselves, they spoke openly of the date. Survivors attended one another's final Decembers, traveling hundreds of miles, to be present on the night before the solstice part. Farewell part grim ritual. Many kept journals addressed to their children explaining what was to come and how to prepare them for it. The family gatherings of December 20th became macabre in their gentleness. Good meals, shared memories, and long wordless embraces. The next day, the chosen would make sure their children were safely away, then settle in for the inevitable. Some awaited it calmly, like a long-promised visitor. Others drank heavily or prayed in desperation. No matter the approach, the outcome never changed, and so the pattern continued untouched by geography, technology, or circumstance. Fires claimed Merricks in grand mansions, modest farmhouses, even remote cabins. They claimed them in city hotels, on riverboats, and once in a supposedly fireproof building of stone and steel. But the fire always found its way, and it never took anyone except its intended. To the Merricks, luck had become a double-edged sword. The 20 years of prosperity were real, tangible, and so was the cost. By mid-century, it was clear to everyone in the bloodline the fire was not an accident. It was an appointment, the origins and power of the Black Ring. It was during this era of grim acceptance that the family began to trace the curse's tangible focus, the Black Ring. Its first documented appearance was on Jonathan Merrick's hand upon his return from his missing year, but the object itself was far older. By the 1870s, a relative named Henry Merrick had traced it to an obscure Eastern European cult dedicated to entities described only as those who walk in flame. In their scattered writings, the ring was one of 7 keys capable of opening channels between the human world and the place where these beings resided. Each key, the texts claimed, could grant immense prosperity in exchange for a toll paid in fire. What made the Merrick case unique was not the bargain itself. Others had been tempted into similar compacts, but Jonathan's decision to bind his descendants into it. This was no ordinary pact between man and spirit. It was a multi-generational covenant. The ring was both token and tether, the physical anchor of an agreement that could not easily be broken. Its black stone seemed to absorb light, swallowing reflections instead of returning them. Witnesses spoke of feeling warmth radiate from it even when it was not being worn. And always when the bearer's 20 years ended, the ring would be found among their remains, untouched by fire, waiting for the next hand. Some Merricks saw it as the source of their fortune, others as a curse incarnate. All understood that it was more than jewelry. It was a promise forged in heat, and it demanded payment. Jonathan's true motivation. By the time later generations pieced together the scattered fragments of their history, one question lingered above all. Why would Jonathan Merrick bind not only himself, but every descendant to follow in such a bargain? The answer, or at least the closest thing to one, emerged from the research of Alexander Merrick, a grandson living in the early 20th century, who inherited a cache of Jonathan's personal papers. Alexander noted that the year of Jonathan's disappearance coincided with one of the harshest famines in New England history. Orphaned, penniless, and without allies, Jonathan faced a winter where children like him were dying daily of cold, hunger, and disease. The bargain, Alexander theorized, began as a desperate bid for survival. But Jonathan did not ask merely to live. He asked to prosper. In his own notes, Alexander wrote, "I believe he wished to not only save himself, but to create a dynasty, a name that would command respect for generations. Such ambition required a greater offering, and so Jonathan pledged not just his own life, but the lives of his bloodline. The entity's terms were simple: 20 years of prosperity for each generation, payment rendered in fire. On the solstice, the children spared to continue the cycle." To Jonathan alone and desperate, the trade may have seemed almost merciful, especially since he would never have to watch the cost accumulate. What he could not have foreseen, or perhaps what he chose to ignore, was how precise and inescapable the debt would be, how each descendant would live not only with wealth, but with the ticking certainty of an appointed death. 20th century deaths. The curse. Adapts, the pattern persisted into the modern era, heedless of changing technology or lifestyle. Merricks died in fires that ignored the laws of probability and physics. In 1916, Richard and Margaret Merrick, aware of their approaching solstice, commissioned a house built entirely of concrete and steel, eliminating flammable materials wherever possible. They installed advanced fire suppression systems and sealed themselves in a safe room with 18-inch thick concrete walls. On December 21st, the house remained intact, but when rescuers breached the safe room, they found nothing but ash where the couple had stood. In 1936, Edward Merrick attempted to document his final night with cameras set to trigger automatically. All but one of the film reels were destroyed. The surviving frame showed Edward mid-conversation with a humanoid figure composed entirely of blue flame. In 1956, another pair of Merricks died in a remote Oregon cabin fire during a rainstorm, the flames burning so hot that nearby puddles hissed into steam. No matter the precautions, geography, architecture, or science, the fire found them. Always on the solstice, always 20 years after their parents, always with their children elsewhere. The curse did not weaken with distance or modernity. It adapted, manifesting in ways that seemed tailored to bypass whatever defenses were erected. If anything, the pattern's precision became sharper, its intent clearer. No one in the bloodline could outrun the appointment. James Merrick, the last heir in hiding. When Charles and Diana Merrick perished in a Chicago apartment blaze on December 21st, 1976, their only son James was spared. Unlike most Merrick children, James was told the truth before adulthood. At 19, he sat in the family study and listened as his parents recounted the history, the 20-year intervals, the spared children, the inescapable solstice fires. They offered him what they called a choice to embrace the inheritance, wealth, health, and unnatural luck for 2 decades, marry, have children, and meet the flames in 1996, or to run, vanish, and never have children, ending the line with him. James chose the latter. He abandoned the Merrick name, moved constantly, and lived in deliberate obscurity. He kept no fixed address for more than a year, worked under false identities, and avoided forming close bonds. Yet even as he evaded the curse's traditional trigger, James could never truly relax. In motel rooms and rented cabins, he studied old Merrick letters, combed through archives, and traced other cases of fire-related deaths with eerily similar patterns. Over decades, he came to believe that the curse was less a fixed destiny and more a compact that demanded the bloodline continue. If no new heirs were born, perhaps the entity's hold would weaken or dissolve entirely. For years, he lived with the conviction that he had outmaneuvered the fire. But in his 60s, James discovered a devastating truth: his father had fathered another child before marriage, Michael Lawson, whose descendants were alive, unaware, and already approaching their appointed solstice. That knowledge would bring James out of hiding and set the final chapter of the Merrick curse into motion. The meeting in the woods. When I first received the email, I nearly deleted it. No subject line, no signature, just an address in the Olympic Peninsula and a single sentence: "If you want to know the truth about the Merricks, come alone on the winter solstice." The email account was deleted minutes after sending. The IP address bounced through so many layers of obfuscation that even my most resourceful contacts shrugged. Still, after 3 years immersed in the Merrick archives, chasing scraps of testimony and rumor, I couldn't ignore it. On the evening of December 21st, 2023, I drove into the deep green silence of Washington State. The road wound through towering evergreens until the last of the winter daylight bled out entirely. There, in a small clearing, stood a modest but sturdy cabin. The man who opened the door had silver hair, eyes that seemed older than his years, and a voice worn thin from disuse. "I'm James," he said, as though that explained everything. Inside the place was warm, cluttered with books and stacks of yellowing paper. A single fire crackled in the hearth. We sat across from each other, the light flickering between us. James spoke without preamble of the curse of the ring of his decades spent running, and of the newly discovered branch of the family, the Lawson line, doomed to meet their fate that very night. He explained his belief that the compact could be broken, but not by evasion. It would require a Merrick who faced the fire, willingly childless and without resistance. "That's why I called you," he said. "I need a witness. Someone to make sure the truth survives if I don't." The last fire, a willing sacrifice. The hours that followed felt suspended, the clock's movement perceptible only in the deepening shadows on the walls. James showed me a small wooden box. Inside lay the ring, black metal blacker stone, its surface swallowing the light. "This is what binds us," he said, his fingers resting lightly on it. As the evening wore on, his manner shifted from the taut energy of confession to something like serenity. He made tea, told small stories about his parents, even laughed once. At 11:45, he slid the ring onto his finger. The temperature in the room rose sharply, though the hearth had burned low. "Leave now," he told me, not as a plea, but as an instruction. "Tell the story." I hesitated, but there was a certainty in his gaze that stilled argument. I gathered the papers he'd set aside for me, manuscripts, family records, notes in his cramped hand, and stepped out into the icy night. By the time I'd driven a mile down the dirt road, I saw it, a column of blue-white flame piercing the dark sky. The fire devoured the cabin with unnatural precision, leaving the surrounding forest untouched. When firefighters arrived, they found nothing, no charred beams, no furniture, not even the metal of the stove. Just a perfect circle of white ash in the snow. It was by every visible measure the final Merrick fire. The cycle appears, broken. In the weeks and months that followed, I searched. I combed obituaries, scanned local fire reports, traced every living relative of the Merricks and the Lawsons. Not one death matched the pattern, not on that solstice night, nor in the strange days after. The family line, as far as I could verify, had been reduced to ashes along with James. For the first time in 2 centuries, there was no heir to send away, no next branch for the fire to reach toward. The cycle seemed, if not broken, then at least interrupted. I began organizing James's research cross-references to similar compacts in other countries, ancient symbols sketched in his notebooks, descriptions of entities that lingered at the threshold of our world. The evidence supported his theory that a willing sacrifice without descendants might end the bargain. But the more I studied, the more I realized that the Merrick curse was not a simple loop snip one thread, and you might still find the fabric intact elsewhere. The fire had been fed for generations. It had grown adapted. Whether it could truly be starved into extinction was a question no one had yet answered. And as the relief of James's apparent victory settled over me, I could not shake the feeling that some ember still smoldered unseen. The hidden journal. A final confession. It was nearly 3 months after James's death when I returned to the site of the cabin. Snow still lay thick in the clearing, yet the circle of ash remained bare, as though the earth itself refused to let anything grow there. I had no clear reason for coming back, perhaps to see if the place felt different, emptied of the presence that had claimed it. But inside the shell of my own curiosity, I carried a quiet hope that James had left me something more. My hunch proved right. Beneath a loose plank in what would have been the cabin's main room, I found a shallow compartment lined with tin to protect its contents from moisture. Inside was a charred leather-bound journal, the edges brittle but its center intact. Most of the pages were scorched beyond reading, words dissolved into flakes of carbon. But here and there, legible fragments survived. They were enough to change my understanding of everything James had told me. He wrote of dreams that mirrored the visions recorded by Merrick's long-dead dreams of a world engulfed in fire, of standing at its heart not as a victim, but as its architect. He described a symbol, a circle, enclosing a single stylized flame that appeared again and again in those dreams. And he wrote of a suspicion that the fire was not merely a method of payment to the entity, but part of a larger process. In one half-burned sentence, I could just make out, "We are not cursed. We are chosen. The entity's purpose. Incubation through blood." James's surviving notes painted a picture more disturbing than the one he'd shared by the fire that final night. The fire that lives between worlds was not just harvesting Merrick lives for sustenance. It was cultivating something inside them. Each generation's fiery death released an ember of itself into the surviving children. Over time, those fragments grew stronger, knitting together across the bloodline, reshaping it. The prosperity the Merricks enjoyed was not simply a reward. It was an investment ensuring the chosen vessels thrived long enough to reproduce and pass along the seed. The fire was not killing to feed. It was killing to prepare. The ultimate aim, James feared, was a manifestation, a moment when the entity would no longer need to trade across the threshold between worlds, but could inhabit a host entirely. And according to his calculations, that host would be the final Merrick, the one in whom all the accumulated fragments would meet. If his theory was right, the cycle wasn't just about sustaining a compact, it was the gestation of something far older and more deliberate. His own sacrifice, he hoped, had severed the chain before that final stage. But his journal was laced with doubt. He wrote of other bloodlines showing similar patterns, of the possibility that the entity could graft its design onto new hosts if the original line failed. His final uncompleted entry ended mid-sentence. "If I am wrong, the fire will seek elsewhere." The wider pattern. Other families marked by fire. The names James listed in his notes sent me down a rabbit hole of research that has not yet ended. The Sanchez family of Arizona, whose ranch has been struck by wildfire every 27 years since 1890, each time killing only family members, sparing ranch hands and neighbors. The Mallisters of Scotland, where every third generation sees the eldest child die in a house fire on their 33rd birthday. The Aloe Vera family in Brazil, whose twins for 6 generations have died in separate fires on the same day when they turned 21. The similarities were impossible to ignore: unusual flames, targeted victims, precise timing, and often a founder story involving sudden wealth or success after hardship. In the Mallisters' case, a diary from 1823 told of an ancestor returning from the Orient with a stone vessel that glowed when touched with blood. The Sanchez legend spoke of a fire spirit in a canyon offering prosperity for the brightest flame of every third generation. The aloe vera tale began when a merchant vanished in the Amazon for 3 days, returning with eyes that reflected firelight even in darkness. Different details, different geographies, but the bones of the pattern were the same. The more I catalogued them, the more certain I became that James's fire that lives between worlds was not unique. It was one of a kind, only in the way a wolf is one of a kind among a pack distinct, but part of a greater whole. And if the Merrick cycle had truly ended, the hunger would not have vanished with it. It would simply be looking for its next line, the new host. My own reflection in the flames. It began subtly, almost too faint to notice, a lingering gaze into a candle flame while waiting for the kettle to boil. The warmth of my hands in the morning as if they'd been cupped over a fire during the night. I brushed it off as a side effect of immersion. After all, I had spent 3 years neck deep in the Merrick archives, steeped in their imagery, their rituals, their history. But then came the sketches. I'd find them in the margins of my notes, drawn without conscious thought, the circle enclosing a single stylized flame. The same symbol James described in his journal, the same one etched into artifacts and dreams across centuries. I began waking from dreams I couldn't fully remember except for the lingering satisfaction that spread through me like embers finding kindling. One morning I discovered a smudge of black ash on my bedsheet. I don't smoke. I hadn't lit a fire in weeks. The thought crept in quietly, then settled in like an unwanted house guest. What if proximity is enough? I had handled the ring, held it in my palm, felt its warmth against my skin. Just before James's final night, I had stood in the same room where the air thickened with heat that wasn't from the hearth. I had watched the sky split open with blue-white flame. What if the seed James described didn't require bloodline, but simply contact? After all, if the entity's aim is manifestation, why be bound by old rules when it can adapt? I began counting forward without meaning to. 20 years from James's death, December 21st, 2043. I will be 65. Would it come for me then? Would it require children to continue its work, or would I become the culmination, the final vessel James feared? The thought coils in my chest during the quiet hours, whispering in a voice that is not quite my own. I find myself avoiding mirrors at night, uneasy with the thought that I might see something looking back. I've considered walking away from all of it, burning my notes, destroying James's research, leaving the story unfinished. But even as I think it, I know it's too late. The fire doesn't need my consent. If it has marked me, my options are the same as every Merrick before me: run and hope, or face it and decide if my life is worth the cost of ending the cycle for good. Only I'm not sure anymore if the cycle is mine to end. Perhaps it has already moved on to another family. Perhaps it's watching more than one of us at once. So I leave you with this, the same way James left it with me. Be careful what you chase, what you invite into your home, what you study until the lines between you and it blur. Some things feed on attention. Some things grow stronger simply by being remembered. And if 20 years from now you hear of my death in a fire, blue-white flames precise and hungry, then you will understand that the Merrick story did not end in the snow of that Washington clearing. It simply changed its name. The ashes we carry. The Merrick story began for me as an investigation, A tangle of half-burned letters, whispered recollections, and newspaper clippings that smelled faintly of smoke even after more than a century. I approached it like any other mystery, armed with curiosity, skepticism, and the comforting belief that the truth once uncovered could be set in a neat frame and understood. That belief is gone now. I have stood in the places where Merricks lived and died. I have walked the empty edge of the blackwood forest, where the ground still feels warmer than it should in winter. I have traced my fingers over the warped stone of an altar that should not exist in a clearing where nothing grows. I have spoken to descendants who pretended not to believe in the curse, their eyes darting to the calendar when I asked about December. And I have sat by a fire with the last man to bear the Merrick name, listening as he offered himself to the flames as if they were an old debt collector finally knocking at his door. I tell myself that James Merrick's sacrifice ended it, that his choice to meet the fire willingly without leaving heirs snapped the chain forged over 2 centuries ago in the heart of Blackwood. It's a good story, clean, decisive, the sort of ending that lets people sleep at night. But then I remember the other names in James's notes. Sanchez Mallister, aloe vera. Other bloodlines marked by precision, by flames that ignore physics and probability, by ancestors who came back from the edge of the world with wealth in their pockets and something far darker coiled around their lineage. If the Merrick fire has gone out, there are others still burning. And there is one detail I cannot forget. The night I left James's cabin before the flames claimed it, he pressed the ring into my hand for a moment. Not to keep, he slipped it back into the box before telling me to go, but long enough for me to feel its warmth. Not the warmth of metal held by another person, but something deeper, steady like a heartbeat. I've wondered since if that was enough. Enough for something to notice me. Enough for something to follow. I used to think of fire as destruction. Now I see it as transformation. It takes what is and makes it into something else, smoke, ash, memory. The Merricks were not simply destroyed. They were shaped generation by generation into something the rest of us were never meant to understand. Maybe James stopped it before the final shape could be completed. Or maybe he only delayed it, bought us 20 years before the ember finds another host. So I will keep watching the calendar. I will keep my smoke detectors fresh, my escape routes clear. I will avoid open flames when I can, though I've caught myself lingering too long over the glow of a stovetop burner, feeling an almost magnetic pull. I tell myself it's just habit, just the residue of too many years immersed in a story where fire is both villain and author. But deep down, I'm not sure. If you are reading this now, take it as both a testimony and a warning. Some bargains are older than the language we use to describe them. Some debts are written in heat and paid in lives. And some fires once lit do not simply burn out. They wait. I cannot tell you for certain that the Merrick curse will return. I cannot tell you that the fire will not find another name, another family, another line of descent to feed upon. But I can tell you this: when patterns repeat across centuries and continents, when the same strange flames turn up in stories that should have no connection, we are not looking at coincidence. We are looking at something patient, something hungry, something that knows how to wait its turn. Whether it comes for me in 2043 or for someone else entirely is no longer the question that keeps me awake. The real question is how many of us are already carrying the spark without knowing it, and how many of us will have the courage when the solstice comes to decide what burns and what survives.